You guys are doing good this morning, and if you would turn to Joshua 5, and as we do that, I want to mention that we've been talking about Genesis chapter 3 verse 15, how that's the theme of the Bible, and then Genesis chapter 12 1 and 2, how that's the outline of the Bible. And so we're going through and we're looking at the promises of God, how we've talked about last week how the land or the nation promise was fulfilled. And then the other promise was the nation promise was fulfilled. And then the second we're going to talk about today is the land promise, and that's going to be fulfilled. And then there's going to be the promise of the blessing. And that's going to carry us through the rest of the Bible. And so looking at this in Joshua 5, last week we talked about Rahab. And so we're backing up just a little bit to get chapter 5, verse 12. And it says, "And the manna ceased the day that they that they ate the produce of the land. There was no longer manna for the people of Israel, but they ate the fruit of the land of Canaan that year." Now, I would imagine eating a different variety was pretty good. I remember being at Oklahoma Christian, and the first time I went up there to visit, it was just amazing. You know, my parents went up there with me, and the track coach came through, and he was like, "Yeah, well, I'll treat you to a meal, and we'll sit down and talk about the program and everything." And I'm just thinking, this is amazing. All the different foods, everything. Man, he brought me there, and I was ready to sign up then. Well, I guess about midway through the freshman year, that food just wasn't near as good. It was the same food, but that was the problem. It was the same food. And I began not to be grateful. And so I wanted something different. Well, you can imagine if that's the case, my senior year, I was really wanting something different. Now, these people had a miracle of 40 years of manna. And so I'd imagine they were ready for something different. And hopefully they got past the point of being ungrateful and realizing this is the only thing that's going to sustain them. Because I know for me, that was the only thing that was going to sustain me. And so I ate it. But there was days I just looked at it and I just wasn't that hungry for it. But it kind of goes along with sometimes that's the way we are. We're pretty ungrateful about things, or ungrateful. And so it's amazing how God took care of them through all of that. And manna stopped as soon as they ate something else. And it just goes to show you how he protected them the whole way through, all those 40 years. So I wanted to bring that out to you. So they're going through, and at that point, then it stops. Now, if you go over to the walls of Jericho have come down, they're coming through. And in chapter 8, verse 1 and 2, the Lord said to Joshua, "Do not fear or be dismayed." Now that's very similar to what he's going to talk about, or what he did say in chapter 1 of Joshua. And we're in Joshua 8, 1 and 2. "Do not fear or be dismayed. Take all the fighting men with you, arise and go up to Ai. And I have given into your hand the king of Ai and the people of his city of the land. And you shall do to Ai and its king as you did to Jericho and its king. Only its spoils and its livestock you shall take as plunder for yourselves. Lay ambush against the city and city behind it." So he's talking about now they're just marching. They're going through. And to me, I'm looking at that thinking that would be something. Because have you ever seen anybody have a victory parade before the parade? But it seems like that's what they're doing. They're going through, and we've already got this thing. And so they're following exactly what God says as they're going through. Look in Joshua 8, same chapter. And all of a sudden, now we see a change. We see that Moses, he is passed. Joshua is now taking the lead. And in verse 34, it says, "And afterward, he read all the words of the law." Now that's very similar to what Moses did. Or it's exactly what Moses did. He read all the words of the law, the blessing and the curse according to all that was written in the book of the law. And there was not a word of all that Moses commanded that Joshua did not read before the assembly of Israel, and the women, and the little ones, and the sojourners who lived with them. And so, once again, it's about making sure God's word is in the forefront. So as they're marching through, he wants to make sure that we're following God's word, because they messed up in the past and grumbled and complained. And so now they're trying to get this right. It's a situation where we should be in the same way, where we're constantly reviewing and going over what God says. How many times have you read the Bible, a certain passage, and you're like, I don't remember that being in there? Yeah, right? And you know why we do that? Same here. It's because we're not in it enough. You're like, oh, that's what that said. I remember specifically in certain classes someone bringing something up, and I was like, nah, I don't know about that. And I go back and check, and I said, sure enough. And it's because I'm not as familiar as I should be. And so for us, I don't know that we could ever get to the point where we're just, saying, I'm good, I'm done. I've told you about the 94-year-old man that said every time he read the Bible, he found something new. And he just, he'd spend hours in the Bible. And it was amazing. And some of you guys know him, Brother Brookmo, and just a continual student. He passed away a few years ago. He was at 103 when he did. And so in chapter 9, now we see they're going to start going through. And the reason why I bring this up is because of where these guys come from. Now in chapter 9, verse 1, it says, as soon as the kings were beyond the Jordan, the hill country and the lowlands along the coast of the great sea towards Lebanon, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites heard of this and came together as one to fight Joshua and Israel. But Gibeon heard, and they decided about Jericho and Ai, and they decided to go another route. As some of you recall, they decided in verse 4 to act very cunningly. And so they decide in verse 6 to act like they're from a distant place and say, hey, we're from a long place, so, we want to make peace with you. Well, now they were told, don't make peace with any of the groups around. Now, it says, I think it's good now. In verse 11, the elders and the inhabitants of the country said to us, take provisions in your hand of the journey and go meet and say to them, we are your servants. Come now, make a covenant with us. They mention make a covenant with us 2 different times here. And the reason why that's really interesting is because they weren't supposed to be making a covenant with anybody there. And when you start making covenants with people that are not like-minded, you're going to end up in trouble. And so that's exactly what takes place with them. But the biggest problem with that comes from verse 14. What did they not do, or what did maybe they forget to do? They're supposed to be asking God about this stuff, and they forgot to seek his counsel. All right, how many times we've been guilty of that? Something big comes up, big decision, and we don't seek his counsel. Luke 6 talks about Jesus going out to pray, and he prays all night long, and the next day he comes and he goes ahead and chooses his apostles. He's praying all night long for that decision. And sometimes we make those decisions just so fast, so quickly, and makes me kind of wonder if we're making the right decisions at times. Sometimes we just kind of luck into it and God's just blessing us, in spite of. But here, they did not seek counsel from the Lord. And so Joshua in verse 15 made peace with them and made a covenant with them to let them live, and the leaders of the congregation swore to them. And so it's only afterward in verse 16 that they find that they were really neighbors. Because these guys, they dressed up in rag clothes and, seemed like they were coming from a long ways away. And they just fooled them. So now, because of that, they're going to end up being servants. They're not going to be equals. They're going to be servants to Israel. but they shouldn't have made a deal with Israel. It goes along with the fact that God wants you to be equally yoked. He doesn't want you coming in with a non-believer and you together, because that's not going to work. And so here, this takes place. But the interesting thing, I think, is where these Gibeonites come from. Because if you look over in 2 Samuel right quick, hold your spot here, but look over in 2 Samuel, you'll see where they come from, and you'll see that they're really not that good a group of people. 2 Samuel chapter 2. Man, I had it down. So maybe it's 2 or 1 Samuel. So let me check it out before you guys start turning to it. I should have put my glasses on while I was doing that. I should have them on right now too. All right, I'm going to have to go back and get that verse, because it's a verse that's worth looking at. I think I know what I did. Hang on. No, it's 21:2. So basically, I put the colon in the wrong spot. All right, so it's 21:2. It says, so the king called the Gibeonites. So I'll let you turn and look at it. 2 Samuel 21, verse 2. And that second sentence there of that verse, it says, the Gibeonites were not of the people of Israel, but were the remnant of the Amorites. Now, do you recall in Genesis, where it talked about the evil that the Amorites had done had not yet gotten to that capacity for Israel to come in and take over that land? And so he was going to keep the Israelites in Egypt for 400 years till the Amorites, till that sin was so great, then he was going to remove them. And that just shows you the patience of God, allowing 400 years to get it right. And if not, well, the Israelites are coming in. And so these people are from the Amorites, a bad group of people. So it's not just that they're neighbors and these poor guys. No, they're not good guys to begin with. And so we're going to see that when you start making deals with different people, it really starts hurting you. We're going to see this in the case today as we go through Joshua. But go back to Joshua. And thank you, Ronnie. I need to make sure let's see, where are those? Here we go. My little reader's on. This is sad. Julie, you can start making fun of me. I know you want to. I went to the doctor a while back, and they said, well, you can have the least prescription possible, or you could just wear the ones, the +1 or whatever. It's amazing what that does. Man, it's like magic. And so, yeah, amazing. At 49. All right. What's that? That's exactly right. You see a little gray coming on here? Yeah. Oh, I imagine it does get better. Oh. Yeah, the hearing aids next. I was about to say what, but all right. You guys are something else. All right. So let's keep going in Joshua. Go back to Joshua chapter 8. I want to make sure I have this right. All right. Okay, so now, if you look in chapter 8, verses 25 and 26. And, man, I can't believe that so many of these verses are off today from what I have. And, man. All right, so it was actually supposed to be 36. That shows in my writing here when I'm not with my glasses. But look up in verse 29. All right, so in verse 29 of chapter 8, it says, and he hanged the king of Ai on a tree till evening. And then Joshua took his body down from the tree and threw it at the entrance of the gate and raised up a heap of stones on which it stands today. Now, he goes and they're going to fight 5 kings, and they're going to do that to all of them. They're going to hang them on a tree. Now, the reason why that is so interesting is because it talks about in Deuteronomy 21. If you go to Deuteronomy 21, and we'll start in verse 22 and 23. Or not start, that'll be the only verses we look at. So Deuteronomy 21, 22 and 23. And if a man has committed a crime punishable by death, he is put to death, you shall hang him on a tree. His body shall not remain all night on the tree, but you shall bury him the same day. For a hanged man is cursed by God. You shall not defile your land that the Lord your God has given you for an inheritance. So that's what they're supposed to do. If you do something that deserves death, you hang him on a tree. Now, do we recall scripture in the New Testament of someone being hung on a tree? Our Lord, isn't it? So let's take a look and make sure that's right. Go to Acts chapter 5. And we'll look at a few verses here. So they hung their enemies on a tree. Joshua did. And that's what they know from their law is you hang a person that deserves death on a tree, but you bury him that same day. Well, that's what happened to Jesus, but just to make sure the wording is accurate, in chapter 5, verse 30, Peter's talking and says, the God of our fathers raised Jesus, whom you killed by hanging him on a tree. Because they believed he deserved death, so they hung him on a tree. As the Romans would call it, crucifying. In chapter 10, verse 39, Peter's talking again, and he says, we are all witnesses of all that he did in the country of the Jews and in Jerusalem. They put him to death by hanging him on a tree. Look in chapter 13, verse 29. This is Paul talking here. In verse 29, and when they had carried out all that was written of him, they took him down from the tree and laid him in a tomb. Buried him the same day, didn't they? And so they're following what Deuteronomy's talking about. And isn't that amazing? It just is exactly what God said all the way through. They didn't realize they were following God's plan because they think it's their plan. And so we see that, it mentions in Galatians and 1 Peter as well, so we don't have to go through that. But it's talking about that. And so anytime you see reference to that, that's what it's talking about. And Joshua did the same thing to the enemies. And so I just thought that was interesting because we're talking about those three promises. And that blessing, that third promise, is Jesus, and they're going to do the same thing to him, not realizing they're following God's plan. Now, going back, was there a comment? Going back to Joshua. Look at Joshua chapter 13. Now, the rest of this has them marching through and doing all these different things. And, as they're going through, and in chapter 13, well, let's take a look in chapter 11. Because it kind of gives an inkling, like, is this the fulfillment of when the land is done? And so it kind of gives you a possible question. I don't believe so, but it kind of gives you some indication. In verse 23, so the last verse in chapter 11, it says, so Joshua took the whole land according to the law, to all that the Lord had spoken to Moses. And Joshua gave it for inheritance to Israel according to their tribal allotments, and the land rested from war. So it seems like that would be the case, but what I think is happening is, in Joshua, you go back and forth in time. So these things happen, but then he talks about, okay, who got the allotment of the land? And then it goes back, and so it kind of goes back and forth. It's not just a complete, accurate timeline in this book. So now it talks about some of those being defeated. But look in chapter 13. in verse 13, and it says that Israel did not drive out certain groups, but they dwelt in the midst of Israel to this day. So when this was being written, they had failed to do what God told them to do, to move these people completely out. And so that's going to cause a problem. Later on, it's going to cause a major problem. Now, as you go, look in chapter 14. And we're going to hit a little bit of this. This doesn't necessarily have to do with the story. All is, but just the highlights that I'm doing for the three promises. But I do want to mention it. In chapter 14, verse 6, you have Caleb. And Caleb, in verse 7, it says, I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me to Kadesh Barnea to spy out the land. And he was with Joshua. Those are the two spies that said, hey, we can conquer this. But the other 10 said no, and so they had to march around all the wilderness for 40 years till that generation died off, and you had faithful people that would follow God to go into the land. And so he says in verse 8, he says, but my brothers who were with me made the heart of the people melt. Yet I wholly followed the Lord my God. And Moses swore on this day, saying, surely the land on which your feet has trodden shall be an inheritance for you and your children forever, because you have wholly followed the Lord your God. And then he says in verse 10, he says, man, I'm 85 today. And this shows you the miraculous of what God did. But I'm still as strong as today as I was the day Moses sent me. And so now I wish we could say that we're as strong as we were at a certain age, but he was. It's just the same miracle of still having the same clothes that don't wear out. It's the same miracle of still having manna every day until you reach Canaan where you don't need it anymore. It's the same miracle that goes on all the time for them. And so he says, I'm just as strong today. And he says, as he goes on in verse 11, he says, my strength now is as my strength was then, for war and for going and coming. And he's like, just let me in there. Now, what kind of spirit is that? Just let me go. Just take the shackles off me and let me get after it. I want this land. This was promised to me. I want to go get it. Now think about if we kind of had that spirit as Christians. I'm going to go get it. We're going to go ahead and we're going to win this community over for Christ. We're going to make this thing happen. And not just this community, we're going to go ahead and get the whole county. And we're not going to stop there. We're going to go for the state. We're going to go for the country. We're going for the world, because if you look back in Acts, in chapter 1, there were 120. And it says about 120 that met. That's it. And then all of a sudden, by the time you get to Colossians chapter 1:23, it said, Paul says, the whole world had heard. So that's people that just said, let me go. Just let me get after it. If you look in Acts chapter 8, in verse 4, it says, wherever those went, they all scattered after Stephen was killed. And it says, wherever they went, they scattered and they took the gospel. They taught everywhere they went. They didn't just go and say, well, that was a good one. We tried our best. No, they were active. They didn't just sit there and just say, well, we had some good years. We had a good run. They're constantly working. And I just look and think, man, if we had the spirit of Caleb, how contagious is that? Isn't that something where if you have one person that's excited and motivated, all of a sudden, there comes another one who is kind of somewhat excited and motivated, and now they really are. And the next thing, it just keeps going, doesn't it? That's what it should be here. We should be doing the same thing. He's 85 and he's got that spirit. Now, I know he's got the energy, but we can all have the spirit whether we have that energy or not. There's always some things that we can be doing. So I look at this guy as a great example for us because he was outnumbered. You've got the whole community, and it's just him and Joshua. That's it. And they still don't bow down to everybody. Can you imagine? You're the only ones, you and Joshua, because Moses is now passed on at this point, but you're the oldest people there by a long shot. Just you and Joshua. And Can you imagine being outnumbered? That many people, just you two? And it doesn't say that they cowered down. So now looking at the fact they didn't cower down, they're marching 40 years for the knuckleheads that are with them. Because those people didn't have the spirit to believe that God could do what he promised. Can you imagine getting up every day? 40 years. I got to do it again because of you guys. You know, that'd be pretty frustrating, wouldn't it? Oh, I'd be frustrated. I'd be frustrated after the second day. Like, are you kidding me? We're going to have to do this? And I got to wait for you guys to die? Oh my goodness. And you've got pretty good health. I'm going to be waiting a long time. You know, and so that would have been frustrating because that was not an easy life. But these guys didn't lose spirit. And so looking at this guy, and it doesn't talk about, it talks about Joshua. He becomes one of the leaders. He becomes a leader next after Moses. Caleb wasn't. Caleb's a soldier. Caleb's a guy that just let me out there. We need more soldiers, don't we? We need more people willing to go get it and go out there and just take 30 minutes of courage to ask someone to study with them. Take 30 minutes of courage to say, hey, can I help you out? And be a friend and be a neighbor to somebody. Whereas I look at him and I get a lot of lessons and examples of what he's like. And anybody have any comments before we go on?
Well, the land that he traced through
Yes.
was his inheritance.
That's right.
And so that's another promise that God made that has been fulfilled. And we know that God has made promises to us through his word.
Right.
If we would just do as Joshua and Caleb and keep the faith and keep striving, those promises will come.
You know, and the interesting thing is, these promises have been promised way back with Abraham. And they've taken a long time for some of these to get fulfilled. Last week we finally talked about they became a nation. That was done when we get to Deuteronomy chapter 1. Now, all of a sudden, we're finally getting to, are they getting it? There was a lot of fighting that took place. It's a lot of time. Look in verse 15 of chapter 14. And here it says, and the land had rest from war. It seems as though it's being fulfilled. Now, they start giving allotments out. But in chapter 18, matter of fact, there's a couple things that I want to make sure that we hit. Look in verse 16, chapter 10 right quick. Chapter 16, verse 10. This theme keeps coming up. They talked about they didn't drive out certain people. Well, in chapter 16, verse 10, it says, however, they did not drive out the Canaanites. So they lived in the midst of Ephraim to this day, and have been made to do forced labor. And so they didn't drive them out completely. In chapter 17, verse 13, it says, Israel grew strong. They put the Canaanites to forced labor, but they did not drive them out completely. You're going to see the fact that they don't push out people completely. And it's going to end up being a snare. It was a snare for Solomon. It's going to be a snare later on. We talked about when we got to Numbers how the Moabites intermingled with the Israelites, and that caused them to worship Baal instead of God. And so now in chapter 18, this would be a question for us. In verse 3, chapter 18, verse 3. So Joshua said to the people, how long will you put off going to take possession of the land which the Lord your God of your fathers has given you? And that could be a question for us, just tweaked up a little bit. How long is it going to take for us to realize God keeps his promises? How long is it going to be for us to realize that he's always faithful? How long is it going to take for us to know that he's always going to protect us no matter what situation? How long is it going to take for us to know that he's going to give us everything that we need if we just seek the kingdom first? How long will it take for us to to put our whole faith into him, how long will it take for us to deny ourselves, pick up our cross, and daily follow him? How long will it take for us to be totally sold out to God? And I don't know where you are in your spiritual inventory and what's going on in your world. But I start asking myself those questions, and they get pretty personal pretty quick. How long is it going to be for Michael? How long are we going to be doing this? How long is it for us to start being the church instead of playing the church? How long is it for us to start talking and sharing our faith? How long is those things going to be? How long is it going to be for us to get involved in our neighbors' lives, to develop relationships in the people around us, so we can have an impact and influence on them for the better? How long is that going to be? And so I look at that question, and verse 3 is a rhetorical question. How long is, it shouldn't take any time. You've had all this time to see all these miraculous events going on. Man, you need to go. That's what you need. You need to go. And that's for us. I've mentioned before, it ought to say right out here as we're leaving, it ought to say entering the mission field. Because that's what we're doing. Right there, as we exit out, it ought to say, now you're entering the mission field. Because we've got people that are dying to hear what the gospel has to tell them. There are people out there, but are we dying to tell? You know, if there was a movie that was playing and we were late for that movie, you know, and we really wanted to see it, or if it was overcrowded or whatever the case may be, we couldn't get in, couldn't see it on time because we want to see it at the beginning, we'd go find another one, wouldn't we? We'd go find another movie theater playing that same movie at a different time and a place where we could go and check it out. We wouldn't be denied of watching that movie. I think the same is true for us. If there's a person that says, no, I'm not interested in listening to what the good news is about Jesus, well, I don't think we'd stop there if we were really sold out. We'd say, okay, I'm going to go get the next person. I'm going to go to the next movie theater per se. Because I need to see this. I need to show someone. I need to tell someone. And so I'm amazed at it sometimes, and I'm using us, meaning all of us. There's more than just one person. Because I look at it, are we doing all that we can do? Because God has given us some amazing abilities, some amazing talents. Are we utilizing them? Because I know that, you know, they say that the most talented place is in the graveyard. Got all these untapped talents there that people just didn't utilize. And so for us, is that going to be said of us? Or are they going to say after we're gone, man, they used it up. They used every ounce for God. That's what he talks about when he says deny yourself. Pick up that cross and follow me daily. It's going to be tough. It's going to be difficult. And so with them, they start marching through because all of a sudden now they're starting to have faith. Now they're starting to say, God, we can do this. The hearts of everybody around them is melting as they're walking through one victory after another. And so you can imagine their faith is growing, but all of a sudden they get complacent. And sometimes we can get complacent when good things take place. We're like, hey, we don't have to do anything. We just sit and let's put this thing on coast. But he says, how long is it going to be for you to go and take it all? You've got some of it, but you don't have all of it. You don't have all the promises. You need to go get it. So he divides up people and they go and they start going after it. Now look in chapter 21.
Michael,
Yes. Yes, sir.
Go back 40 plus years when they sent in the spies to start with. And it talks about Rahab, how she said the people's hearts were melted.
Right.
When they crossed the Red Sea and the Egyptian army was destroyed. That was a fear in them back then, and if they would have just went in like the Lord had told them to, they could have conquered the land then, because the people were just as afraid then as they were now whenever they came and was going to march around the walls of Jericho.
Right.
it's amazing how God will protect us and how He will keep us if we will just have the faith to go and do what He says.
And there's another lesson in there is about his patience, isn't it? Because he sure was patient with those people. And I know he's been patient with me. We could all probably say that. The things that we've done, the things we've thought, and how patient God is with us to get things right in our lives, and that he's still being patient with us. Chapter 21, thank you for that. Chapter 21, verse 43, we finally have the finish. Thus the Lord gave to Israel all the land that he swore to give to their fathers. And they took possession of it, and they settled there. And the Lord gave them rest on every side, as he swore to their fathers. Not one of their enemies had withstood them. For the Lord had given all their enemies into their hands. Not one word of the good promises that the Lord made to the house of Israel failed. All came to pass. And that's the amazing thing about God. Because we see a very imperfect group of people. Those lessons are there, as it talks about in Romans. Those things are there to teach us lessons. They grumbled and complained. They saw miracles every day. And so you think about when the slightest little thing doesn't go our way. And he was still patient with them. And he was still working in their lives. Well, he still works in our lives. Because Romans chapter 8 is still true. He works out all things. In verse 28, works out all things for the good, for those that love him, been called according to his purpose. And the amazing thing, it says according to his purpose. He's going to work things out according to his plan. His plan is for all to be saved, and those that are saved be more like his son. So that's how he's going to work it out. So it may not work out exactly the way you want it, but he will work it out for the betterment of all of us. But in chapter 22, there's a warning. Only be very careful to observe the commandments of the law that Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded you, to love the Lord your God, and to walk in all his ways, and to keep his commandments, and to cling to him, to serve him with all your heart and with all your soul. Now that's a charge, isn't it? That means deny yourself, pick up your cross, and daily follow me. That would be a New Testament way of saying this verse right here. So he wants, how much of us does he want then? What percentage? Yeah, he wants 100% of us. After all, he's the one that made us. He's the one that gave us the talents and abilities we have. And when we start thinking, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that, it amazes me and makes me wonder what God would say if we're not totally invested with him. You think about how much time you waste a day. Same here on my end. How much time you waste a day. And God is saying he's the same God now. He doesn't change. I wanted everything from them. I want it all from you. Because if you have a group of people that's fired up, is that not contagious? I mean, it's one of those things where if you have a group of people, man, you want to be a part of that. You know, Eric, you got a football team that if you have a group of guys that are fired up, doesn't that mean that other people want to start joining the football team? I mean, it just creates it, doesn't it? You have success, and success begets success. You have more people wanting to be a part of it. I remember a congregation I was at years ago, and we started teaching. And when I say we, I mean we. All of us started talking, started reaching our neighbors. And it didn't take long. And there were some studies that I did for other people, no doubt, if they didn't feel comfortable. But we started growing. And I looked back and looked at the growth that took place that year. We ended up being the largest religious group in that community. And everybody wanted to know what we were doing. And they were surprised when we said we didn't have a big fancy band. They were surprised when they didn't say we didn't have, fireworks shooting off in the sky. They were surprised when we didn't have all these entertaining things. And we just said, man, we're just teaching the gospel. That's all we're doing here. And it was intriguing to them. And they wanted to know about it. And all of a sudden, we just started growing. I mean, there was more than a baptism a week. It was just growing because people were all in. And all the amount of excitement, and then it just kept, and then all of a sudden you can't contain it. It just kept growing and kept growing. And so that's what's taking place here. We finally rested from war in Joshua. And there's going to be groups that are going to be begging. Just let us be your servants here. They're going to want to be a part of this. You have the woman we talked about last week, Rahab, just saying, hey, just let me be a part. You know, I'll do whatever. So think about what ways you can increase your game, per se, to be all in for God. What are some weak areas that you need to make stronger? And hopefully you get a chance to start reevaluating yourself and make some spiritual goals to get yourself in a place where you can say you've denied yourself and you've picked up your cross and you're daily following Him. Thank you, everybody.